let's get into it. So everything that we treat on in this container is based on these pillars that we have, and they probably sound really familiar to you, right? Like nutrition and recovery and movement and stress management. Okay. These are very basic things that I do want us to become experts at. And I believe that all of us were born perfect. Okay. And the way to cultivate health is not necessarily by having to add things, but more so cultivating a lifestyle and removing some of the toxic elements or behaviors that have put us in this position. Okay. And I'm going to be speaking a lot about the American healthcare system, primarily because that's where we have data from, but you can generalize this into the Western system, okay, where most of us are involved in. So the truth is that Americans specifically are getting sicker every year. Okay. And our health is getting destroyed and we're spending more money. Okay. It doesn't make sense. Right. So I'm going to drop some stats for you. Okay. Some of them a little bit alarming. A lot of these come from studies that Dr. Casey Means have put together. And I'm just going to go through them one by one, okay, to really let them sink in. The first should be alarming that 74% of American adults are overweight or obese. Right? 40% of children are overweight or obese. Okay? 52, so over half of American adults have pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. And a lot of the times with pre-diabetes, sometimes people don't even know it. Okay, this is categorized by our fasting blood glucose levels, typically insulin and A1C. 30% of teenagers have prediabetes. Okay, this was only 11% in 2002. It was just 2 decades ago, all right? 1 in 36 children are on the autism spectrum, and this has gone up a ton from 1 in 150, which was back in the year 2000. And in the state of California, that number is 1 in 22. Okay, if you're unfamiliar, 1 in 22 children in California are on the autism spectrum. Okay. 34% of young adults, this is alarming, have a mental, emotional, or behavioral disorder. They're often put on medication for it. Okay, 1 in 3 of your friends. Right. Incidence of early onset cancer, so getting cancer at a young age, has increased by 79%. And if you're unfamiliar with how cancer works, it takes about 5 mutations in a specific DNA strand to then have a cancerous cell. And these things can come from toxins in the environment or malfunctions based on behavior. Okay. 1 in 2 Americans almost is predicted to get cancer in their lifetimes. It's about 41.6% chance. That's crazy. And this is the first year that America is estimated to have over 2 million new cases of cancer, right? A little bit more continued, maybe a little bit more applicable here. Autoimmune diseases are rising rapidly. The rates are variable depending on the study, at least 3, but upwards of 12% per year. A lot of them are unreported because a lot of people don't know if they have autoimmune disease. 18% of teens have fatty liver only associated with alcoholism in middle-aged adults. Okay. 20 to 25% of women are on an antidepressant medication. Okay. That's like 1 in every 4 or 5 women. We've got early onset dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which there aren't cures for, have tripled since 2013. American girls, they're starting puberty a lot earlier. You hear of these little grade schoolers getting their cycles a lot sooner. And in North America, we're getting them sooner than anywhere else in the world. So that tells us that there's a problem with our environment. This one's extremely concerning, and I see it all the time. Infertility rates are rising by 1% every year, and sperm counts are decreasing by 1% every year. So we talk about having an infertility issue, it's happening on both ends. And life expectancy is seeing a decline, kind of driven by COVID, kind of driven by this chronic liver disease, heart disease, and actually suicide from some of the mental disorders that we're seeing. And to be honest, the most upsetting statistic to me is that 93% of the American population is metabolically unhealthy. All right, this stat was 88%. Okay, so 12% of the population was healthy in 2018. That was only 6 years ago, and that was a study that was done by the UNC. But then the Journal of American Cardiology did a follow-up, and it showed the numbers got worse. Okay, we got 5% worse in 5 to 6 years. That is showing us that metabolic health is crucial to address. All right. And the reason it's so important, we'll talk about metabolism, what that means. It's how your body efficiently converts food into energy. Okay. And that's going to impact things like your energy levels, your hormones, your risk of chronic disease like obesity, heart disease. You need a strong metabolism to not only live a long, healthy life, but have mental clarity and a balanced weight. A lot of the things you came into this container for, right? Metabolism is what we are looking to optimize here. In fact, I used to call Radiant Revival metabolic mastery. It's what I used to call that container. And so I like to just go over first what it means to be metabolically healthy. And this is actually according to the studies that have been done. All right. This doesn't even consider functional ranges, which for me is a lot tighter. Right. And remember that only 7% of the population meets this criteria. Right? They're not even the functional ranges. The first is that we want to measure the waistline, that in women it's less than 35 inches and in men it's less than 40. All right, blood pressure standard 120/80, and you cannot be on blood pressure medication. So it's typically lower it, right? Triglycerides, less than 150. Fasting blood sugar, something we talk about a lot here in this container, less than 100 in standard ranges, and typically in functional ranges, we want it like sub 85. Okay. HDL, that's what's most commonly known as like good cholesterol. We want it higher than 50 in women and higher than 40 in men. Okay. And so again, only 7% of these people are meeting all 5 of these. And if 3 of the 5 of these are not true, okay, you're at risk for insulin resistance. Those stats are super alarming, right? Nobody wants this. Nobody wants this at all. And the problem is that the healthcare system is rigged against the American patient to create diseases and profit off of them. Okay. And this is happening across almost every lever of major industries. We're talking like processed food to tech to pharma. And I'm going to get into all of those today. And what we really need to understand is how those work, right? See those trends so we can stop them, at least in our lives. And we need to understand why we're sick, okay? Which again, primarily the toxic food system and the way that these industries are profiting off addiction and illness. So I'm going to explain a little bit how the healthcare system works. You guys know I love my car analogies, okay? We can think of the healthcare system like as an assembly line that makes the car, okay? Your body is the car. Do you think if 80 to 90% of the cars coming off of this assembly line were not working well, like you had an issue with the tires or the engine or the transmission, right? All these issues with cars. Do you think that the car manufacturer would tolerate that? Okay, the manufacturer and the customers are not going to tolerate it. Yet we tolerate this with our bodies. Okay. And what happens in the current system is that we get one person to fix each part of the car. Okay. Someone for the tires, someone to specialize in the engine, someone else for the battery. Does that sound familiar, right? Like a specialist for every part. Okay. This is the American healthcare system. We're referred to multiple specialists to fix problems that are occurring further up the assembly line at the root. And so how you make money in the American healthcare system is that you put a patient with 10 different issues, you send them to 10 different specialists, you put them on 10 different medications, and eventually you could have like 10 different surgeries, right? You're never actually taught how to put the pieces together and look at the whole body as a system, right? Because it is, you are whole, it is a system. And so what we need to do is we need someone to fix the hardware, right? That's installed into the car to make sure it doesn't come off broken. And the good news is that's what we're doing here at Lifestyle, okay? And we'll be going over each of these, right? How the current system operates and how you can optimize your function. This is our first pillar. Again, you should recognize each of these. Okay. And I do like to kind of go into why this all happened. Okay. So when we talk about nutrition, we talk about doctors. We need to understand that 90% of medical schools don't offer or even require one nutrition class. It's not even a requirement. Usually 80% of the course load is in pharmacology. And so we're supposed to trust these people, and they're just not learning why people are getting sick, which we would assume that they would, right? And 100 years ago, our food system didn't exist the way it does. So when we want to understand why something operates as it does, follow the money. So little history lesson for you if you're unfamiliar. In the 1980s, okay, the Surgeon General said that cigarettes are a problem. Okay, we all know this. Everybody knows, right? Cigarettes are an issue, which at the time, tobacco industries held like the largest cash piles of the world. So the two cigarette companies that are most prominent, you're going to see them here on the left, R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris. Okay, they were the two primary companies at the time, right? They started buying food companies. Okay. By the 1990s, those two names were the largest food companies in the world. So I want you to ask yourself, why are cigarette companies buying food companies? Okay, they bought them in the 90s, and notice how their stock price started to rise in the 2000s. What happened? Okay, why did they start to become more profitable? There were two things that happened that they started to cultivate in the 90s. The first is that there was the rise of ultra processed food to make foods more palatable. They literally have chemists creating formulas via toxic oils, ultra processed sugar, ultra processed grains to make things more palatable, right? Less nutrients, but we want to eat them. They're more addictive. Okay? Buy more food. And the second is that the lobbying actually shifted into this food pyramid where we see at the top that animal fats are bad, right? And at the bottom that all these carbs are good. Notice how the ultra processed carbs, these breads, these grains are at the base of this pyramid, which function like sugars, right? And at the time, Harvard actually created a report that said sugar doesn't cause obesity, right? Super interesting, right? You just got to ask yourself why. Okay? So today, state of our food hasn't really changed. In fact, it's gotten a little bit worse, okay? Our processing takes the fiber off of foods, okay, and our grains. 70% of a child's diet is made up of these ultra processed foods, like sugars and grains and oils. We're going to talk about seed oils. Okay, seed oils are things like canola and soybean and corn, cottonseed, peanut, anything that says like hydrogenated oil, it's a seed oil. And seed oils were actually created by John D. Rockefeller. You may have heard that name before, as a byproduct of oil production. Okay, it's basically engine lubricant. And this photo here is how canola oil is made. Just look at that. That is going into foods, which we put into our bodies. And the Rockefellers and people who were aligned with them actually lobbied, again, to have this be suitable for human consumption. Okay, so that's how seed oil came into be. It's cheaper, but it's also highly inflammatory. And the reason that seed oils are super inflammatory is they're filled with omega-6s, and they don't have the balancing omega-3 fatty acids, which we need. And that's what drives up inflammation and free radicals. Now, I just want to say, like, I'm giving this history here, but I don't think that the food industry is trying Americans. Okay. I think they're trying to make food cheap and addictive to make a profit. All right. This shouldn't be fear-based. I just want to explain to you why our food system operates the way it does, so then we can talk about what to do. So when it comes to what we can do about it, I'm going to go through each of these. Okay. We can just start with our food quality, right? It's estimated that we eat anywhere from like 2 to 3 pounds of food per day. So choose the good ones. Right? Where you can, choose the organic, the local, the grass-fed, as much as you can, 80% of the time. It doesn't, if you're not at 80%, that's okay. Start small, right? Make swaps here and there. It's really important to read ingredient labels. We talk about food ordering for blood sugar balance. We need to do that for our metabolic health, okay? Because we already know that some of the food quality is bad as is. Okay, we have good digestion practices, which not only help digestion by eating slower and undistracted, right? It's also going to help the parasympathetic response to actually break down the food so you get the few nutrients that are in them. And making sure we're drinking good quality water and minerals. I won't get into water today. Okay. But we do want to make sure we add minerals where we can because we don't have minerals in the soil like we used to. Okay. So it is good to add more. And I like to also mention that, a lot of us have heard like the calories in, calories out, right? And most here understand that that's kind of been debunked. But the reason that that process doesn't work is because most foods that the majority of people are eating, the ultra processed foods, are devoid of nutrients, right? We're not making them in good soil. We're stripping them of their nutrients and processing. And so really the primary focus is eating these good whole foods to signal to the brain that we have satiety cues. Okay, it seems really basic, but it's a good reminder as to why. So just as food is molecular information for our body, sunlight is also energetic information for how our brains and cells communicate to function. And so our eyes are how our brain gets access to natural light. And we do live in this amazing, convenient world that allows us to order food from our phones. We ride in cars that drive themselves, and we can connect with our loved ones that are halfway across the world. Right? But it has come at a cost. So in talking about circadian rhythm and recovery, I'm briefly going to go over the science of how our photoreceptors, which are light sensitive cells in our retinas, receive this information from sunlight. Okay. When we look at sunlight, there's a whole cascade of events that will signal your suprachiasmatic nucleus, your SCN. Now, your SCN's primary function is to operate as the body's master clock. Okay. Our circadian rhythm. That's our sleep-wake cycle, which impacts everything from food intake to insulin sensitivity to glucose control, energy expenditure. All right. And so during the daytime, you'll see here in the top left, we want to be more sympathetically driven. Okay. So cortisol is going to be a little higher. It's highest when we get up. Blood pressure, temperature, and energy all a little bit higher. Makes sense. And then those markers will all drop, as you see in the top right, to be more parasympathetically driven. Melatonin rises so that we can rest and recover for the next day. The problem is when we expose ourselves to irregular light signals, you can think of getting poor sleep, being indoors too much. I actually heard this is wild. The average American spends 93% of their day indoors. I'm definitely guilty of having done that before, just not walking outside sometimes, right? And we also think about the blue light that's emitted from our electronic devices, our phones, our TVs, especially late at night. And so at the bottom left here, you can see that our SCN, it just becomes confused, right? It's distorted, doesn't know what to do, and that starts to negatively impact things downstream. And so there was a study that Northwestern University did that found that blue light exposure, okay, first thing in the morning and in the evening, negatively impacts your glucose, which makes sense from what we've talked about with cortisol release, and that is going to drive up metabolic dysfunction. Okay. Even one night of too much bright light can increase glucose and insulin. So when we talk about sunlight, most people are not getting an optimal amount to properly signal that SCN that controls our circadian rhythm. And the result is horrible. Okay. This lack of alignment with natural light cycles, it actually contributes to pancreas dysfunction, which is the organ that makes insulin. Okay, we get issues with glucose and fat metabolism. We have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, obesity. It's actually really interesting how light and serotonin are linked. If you have less exposure to sunlight, you actually tend to have lower serotonin levels, which can negatively impact your mood. If you have enough serotonin, though, your appetite and glucose are better controlled. I used to live in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the alarming stats out there was Seattle itself, and I believe Washington State and parts of Alaska too, have extremely high suicide rates. Okay, it makes sense. A little less sunlight exposure, negatively impacting the mood. Okay, and we know that sunlight and vitamin D are correlated, right? Which also impacts, obesity and insulin resistance. And a lot of labs, like standard labs, will say that anything above 30 for a vitamin D level is normal, Whereas here in functional medicine, we recommend aiming a lot higher, like anywhere from 50 to 80 on those labs, right? So when we talk about sleep, the other side of the coin, right? We have sunlight and then we have sleep. We know that sleep is important for metabolic health. The data definitely backs this. There was a study on healthy young men so healthy young men, they had 5 nights of sleep deprivation. So they only slept for 4 hours a night, right? And it showed that they exhibited profiles from their blood markers from after those 5 nights to having pre-diabetes, okay? And that's usually through elevated glucose, right? They showed that their metabolism and insulin resistance and their rate of clearing sugar out of the bloodstream was actually 40% slower than when they were well rested. Okay, I'll repeat that. Healthy men, 5 nights, poor sleep, 40% slower at clearing glucose from their system. This is why sleep is so, so important. Okay, we know that because of this, we can develop obesity, diabetes, we see cortisol go up, we see insulin go down, we see blood sugar go up. We overproduce the hormone that makes us hungry, which if you've ever had a bad night of sleep or you've gone out, you wake up in the morning, you're like, I want something sweet. Okay, that's why. It also increases inflammation. So if you're not getting enough sunlight and you're not getting enough sleep alone, you can see how your weight loss efforts or any healing journey would be stalled, right? It's why we're going back to the basics here, things that you can go and do that are free, right? You can get up, get some sunlight within your first hour of waking, okay? Stop the phone at the end of the day. Don't start your day with the phone. Okay, you can use blue light blockers about 2 hours before bed, 1 hour at a minimum. And we can start to see cortisol come down, melatonin production naturally come up. Getting in bed by 10 p.m. is something that I do suggest around there. We have some night owls, right? Your chronotype might be a little bit different, but the hours before midnight are twice as restorative as the hours after. Okay. And at least 7.5 hours for sleep. And I'd say that actually caters more towards men. It's shown that women need a little bit more, closer to 8 to 9 hours of sleep. I know I'm that way. Like I get 8.5. I feel groovy. Moving into our third pillar, movement. I will say that the average American activity, this is really low, and this shocks me, it might shock you too, is people are getting less than 2 miles of walking per day. It's like 3,000 to 4,000 steps is the average that people get per day. And 77% of Americans do not meet the basic exercise guidelines. All right. And some of you may have seen these guidelines before. This is put out by the government. I actually agree with these. I think they're great guidelines for people to start with. The first thing is that we need to get at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity. They say you can get half of that instead if it's like vigorous intensity. But for some reason, 150 minutes kind of sounds like a lot at first. It's really just 30 minutes a day for 5 days. Okay. And the second piece is resistance training. Hey, we need to be strengthening at a minimum 2 days a week of resistance training across all major muscle groups. And remember, 77% of the Western population is not meeting these. I did address this on social media last week, but if you didn't see it, I'm going to perhaps be a little bit touchy by debunking the fact that exercising once a day is good enough. Okay. So according to this study in JAMA, it's the Journal of American Medical Association, they found that taking 7,000 steps per day can reduce your risk of death by an impressive 70%. And actually they had tiers to that. The more steps up to 10,000, I believe they more reduction of risk. 7,000 doesn't seem bad. Okay, but here's the important part. It's not just about hitting your step count, like going out for a walk, you hit your 7,000, that's it, right? What truly matters is that it's low grade movement throughout the day that's going to stimulate more muscle contraction. So when our muscles contract, it actually enables our cells to use glucose more efficiently. And so even though our muscles have access to glucose all the time, right? It also takes it from your bloodstream. And so exercise makes your cells more sensitive to insulin and improves the movement of sugar coming into your cells because it boosts the number of the glucose transporters at the lining of your cells. They're these little GLUT4 channels. So that was a little nitty gritty there. All you need to know is that as you move, as you stimulate muscle contraction, the little guys that go grab glucose actually move from like the center of the cell up to the top so they can be utilized. And in the long term, this is great because physical activity means that not only are you using more glucose, but you can also increase the number of muscle cells, right? That's why we talk about resistance training. And when you increase the number of muscle cells, that means you have more mitochondria, which are the things that turn glucose into energy. So we love weightlifting in this container because it means more muscle, means more glucose utilization. It's why you can eat more calories when you have more muscle. And then the flip side of that is that sitting too much can actually be inhibitory and increases inflammation and more insulin resistance. So more muscle contraction, more glucose uptake, then you have less of these issues like diabetes and fatigue and weight gain, right? And we want this to be more of a constant process throughout the day. I just want you to know that I want you to start thinking about movement as moving more so throughout the day in smaller spurts, even if it's just for a couple minutes, right? Every half hour or hour. Low grade movement, really important. Get your walking in. We know this is important, right? 30 minutes. That's all you need per day of movement. It can be walking, it can be resistance training. You can take a rest day, right? As well. Lower grade movement like mobility, flexibility, even just 5 minutes. Huge for ensuring that you can still move your joints well, right? And when you move after eating, this can be important to help facilitate more glucose uptake, okay? Blood sugar balance. We're going to move on now to our final pillar and probably the most overlooked pillar in the health space. And it is stress management. And the reason this is so important is because it does impact us, right? Stress isn't this obscure thing that is a woo-woo energetic thing. It is. And there's an energetic component to it. But from a hormone standpoint alone, stress impacts a response that's going to increase all sorts of levels. Okay. When you're feeling like frazzled or angry or panicked, right? Your body may think that it has to fight off a threat. And so what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, glucose, go out into the bloodstream because we got to fight, we got to run. The muscles need to be ready. And so to increase blood sugar in your system, your body has to reduce or produce adrenaline, sometimes cortisol, right? Glucagon. And because of that, if we have this constant stress response, then you start to become insulin resistant because we always have glucose, glucose, glucose. Insulin can't keep up with clearing it, right? And that's why there is data out there that shows a link between perceived stress, even work stress, and increased levels of circulating glucose. I've actually had some members in the container who have worn continuous glucose monitors in the past notice that when they are not eating, they are sitting, there's no reason for glucose to really be elevated, but they're working and that their stress starts to come up. We can also see this in heart rate data, right? And so that's why this chronic stress response can lead to prolonged insulin resistance because your body's always coping with elevated cortisol levels, right? Or at least elevated release. The other thing is people also tend to, in these states, some people will choose like less healthy options, less healthy behaviors, not going to go to the gym. They're going to overeat when these hormone signals are off. Okay. And what's important to remember is that our cells hear what we're thinking through hormones and other signaling molecules that are triggered by what's happening in the brain. If your thoughts give your body a sense of a threat, you can think of like anxiety, worry, fear, a trauma response that can impair metabolism. So let's say, for example, you're scrolling on your phone on social media and you see something about the news or something that questions, your state, and you start to have a worried or angry thought, right? Your body is going to interpret that as a threat, right? And that kicks off that chain reaction that we just talked about. Your body's conserving energy for this fight or flight, right? You're going to have to fight something or you're going to have to run that it thinks is coming. right? And so consumption isn't just what we're eating, it's what we're viewing, it's who we're talking to, thought hygiene, right? This is literally your thoughts impacting the way that your cells make and use energy, which means that we have to manage our emotions if we want to achieve optimal health. And it's not just acute stressors, it's not just the stressors that we see now. There's actually a large body of research that shows that adverse childhood events, so these are things that happened in childhood, changes the way that our bodies can regulate stress, which then increases the risk for all those metabolic diseases and all those stats that we saw at the start, right? This metabolic syndrome. And so if you haven't heard of these before, what constitutes an adverse childhood event, right? They can be emotional or physical. It can be neglect, abuse, household dysfunction. So if you grew up in a household with divorce, with violence, substance use disorders, if there was like mental health issues in your family, maybe you were insulted a lot or bullied, or there was crime or a major death of a loved one, right? Life-threatening accidents, even like natural disasters. The research, and I'll argue with the research here, it suggests that like 60% of people are impacted by this, and I would say it's probably most people, right? Let's be honest, most people have had some sort of adverse childhood event. And so when we experience a traumatic event, right, we have that hormone cascade that gets released. And what happens is those levels can become elevated into adulthood, and they can alter your baseline cortisol levels. And so you don't know what's going on as a kid. You get to adulthood, you start to learn about these things. How did I get here? It may not be what you're doing now. You could be doing everything perfect. This could be from years and years and years ago, decades. Right? And so if we have this unprocessed chronic stress or trauma, we are biologically primed to believe that the world is not as safe as it could be. So that's why some people have hormone and neurological responses that are so hard to undo with the basic foods and exercise, right? Because they're constantly perceiving their world as a threat. And I'm just going to touch on this once, okay? We're going to talk about Ozempic. You've probably heard of it, right? You've probably heard people drop weight. You've probably heard some great things. If you don't know what Ozempic is or how it works, it's alike. There's other names for this. It works for weight loss, and it does, but it mimics a hormone called GLP-1. That's a glucagon-like peptide, and we actually do produce this naturally. Some people don't know that, but it's in your gut. And that's why our microbiome is really important, so that we can produce this on our own to eat good foods. But what Ozempic does is it regulates your appetite. It's going to slow down the gastric emptying and enhance insulin secretion. And so by activating these GLP-1 receptors, Ozempic is going to reduce your hunger. It's going to make you feel more full. It's going to help control blood sugar, and it's going to lead to weight loss. Okay. And what's crazy is that the way this was made is the injection itself is a medication that is intended to be taken once a week for life. It's very expensive. It costs about $20,000 per person per year. Wow, what a profitable drug. And there's currently lobbying for obesity to be considered a genetic disease. Okay? And what that means is that right now, happening currently in government, is that they're trying to say that obesity is a genetic disorder. Your parents are obese, so now you're obese. And we know that 100 years ago, this wasn't a problem. And what happens if that bill gets passed is that if obesity is considered to be a genetic disease, it means that children as young as 6 years old can be given this drug, and they now become a patient for life. $20,000 per person per year at the age of 6. Okay? Imagine if you spent that $20,000 per year learning the tools to manage your metabolism forever, or you bought organic whole foods, or you reduce toxicity in your environment. And the problem with Ozempic or things like it, there are many, is that it does not address the root cause as to why 70% of adults and 40% of children are overweight or obese. It doesn't address why we got there. And even if you take the insulin and blood sugar regulation, it also doesn't address the stress response, right? No matter how well you eat, no matter how much you exercise, that stress response will impair the healing because there will still be mechanisms that override glucose and insulin and cortisol levels alone. Okay. So when it comes to any weight loss drug, I know we get curious. I know sometimes you hear, oh, but so-and-so's doing it at work and they lost 30 pounds and they look amazing, right? Please note that losing weight is different than fixing the root cause as to why you got there. That's my Ozempic spiel. Okay? There's always light, right? This is meant to show you a lot of the whys as to why our system functions the way it does and what you can do about it. And there's a lot of data that supports nervous system regulation. Okay. We know that regularly practicing deep breathing can actually lower glucose levels, right? And it activates the parasympathetic system. There was a study that was done with 20 sessions of diaphragmatic breathing, which is like breathing with your stomach, essentially. It lowered cortisol levels. So then in turn, we're going to lower glucose levels. We have lots of modalities. It doesn't have to be breath work. You can use yoga, you can meditate, self-love, reading things, right? That call to you, journaling, have conscious conversations. A lot of them happen in this container, which I'm so grateful for. Maybe people in your life, right? Focusing on the abundance, the awe, the gratitude, right? Taking some time away from social media or other things that influence your thoughts and your patterns. I did a lot of that last week. Took a lot of break away from screens. My screen time was cut by 50%, which was a beautiful thing for me. And the amount of downloads that were able to come through when we're not constantly barraged with information or other thoughts. It's a really beautiful space to be in. And we can't always all take a break or take time off like that, right? We can do is cultivate these micro moments of the pattern interrupts in your day. Take those couple deep breaths, go on that little walk, journal for a moment, call somebody you love, right? Or just state 3 things you're grateful for. Okay, that's a practice that I started a couple years ago. I wake up and the first thing I do is give 3 gratitudes and oh my goodness, it feels so good. And the reason this is important, there's this Taoist statement that translates something to like this, that's life is a process, not an entity. And I want you to know that you are life, right? Meaning you are a process, you're not an entity. And what that means is you're not stuck in your current ways, right? You're not the diagnosis you were given. You're not even a cluster of symptoms. You're not lab data, right? And that should empower you to make the changes necessary to eliminate what's not serving you and to bring in what will.